greatest writer of his generation, and yet he's experienced great tragedy in his life. He considers himself Indian, yet India for years seems to have disowned him. He's won many prizes and awards, yet for a decade he's lived in hiding and sometimes even on the run. How does he cope with these contradictions, and what are the lessons he's learned? Those are just two of the questions I shall put to Salman Rushdie. Salman, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
You're back in India after almost 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is this country still home?
Well, there's a sense in which the country in which you were born and grew up as a child is always home. You know, you never have that feeling about any other place. And I think, you know, anybody who reads my books knows the extent to which my imagination calls this country home. You know,
so if I were to say, is Salman Rushdie Indian or English or Pakistani, which identity would you grab?
Well, not Pakistani. But I mean, I think many of us who are in England of Indian origin see ourselves as having this plural identity, you know, and I think the concept of the British Indian identity is now very well established and developed in Britain. So there are many people there who very deeply feel connected to India and who also deeply feel rooted in Britain because that's been their life experience. And
the reason I ask about the Indian identity is because for years you've had trouble with the Indian government. For instance, in the 90s when you wanted to return, you were denied a visa. At the time, did you feel rejected?
Yes, I did. I felt very hurt. You know, I did feel the, you know, the exile from India to be one of the most painful things of these years, because you know, I love to come, and even though I haven't lived here for a long time, I used to come every year. You know, sometimes briefly, sometimes for an extended period. And it never occurred to me in my wildest dreams that there would be a period of 12 years when I would not set foot in India.
And I suppose psychologically the most difficult thing was the country you called your own was somehow disowning you. It refused to accept you as its.
Well, I mean, the government, you know. And I mean, I think when you talk about countries, you must always make a distinction between the government and the people. You know, I don't equate the British people with the British government.
That's an important distinction.
Yes.
It's a way of keeping the connection with India.
Yes, because I always felt the connection with friends and family and so on here, and you know, it was the reason I was able to go on feeling a link with India, is that I may not physically have been here, but I was talking to people, I was corresponding with people, I was, you know, emailing people, I was following the Indian scene through the press.
And the sad part is, in fact, the problem that you suffered in your life in the last 12 years began because of the Indian reaction to your book. When that happened, did you feel that this was total shattering and disillusionment, or did you also say to yourself, well, it's probably understandable?
Well, I was taken aback by the vehemence, let's say, of what happened. I mean, I think it's never a surprise to a writer if there are some people who don't like your work. You know, I mean, that kind of happens to all writers.
But the ban?
And the ban was a surprise, partly because it was done without the normal due process. Even, you know, the book had not entered the country. It had not been considered by any panel which sits to decide whether books should be permitted or not. It was just banned as a kind of fiat, you know, and I thought that was an undemocratic
so
thing to do.
So it was the arbitrary nature of the whole procedure that upset you?
Yes, nobody was given a chance to defend it, you know, or to argue against the idea of its being banned. See, I mean, the censorship, the anti-censorship argument is really a very simple one. It's that anybody can be broad-minded as long as what is said, broadly speaking, agrees with what you think. You know? So the test of your willingness to espouse freedom of speech begins precisely at the moment when people start saying things you don't like.
Except that there is an opposite view that's often canvassed in India. People say that because sensitivities are so brittle in India, because people can be so easily offended, there is a duty on the state to protect the collective by sometimes restraining the individual. And if the individual has to be curbed and his liberty is restrained, it's being done for a greater good. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't think it's a greater good, because I think there's a greater, deeper damage that is done to a culture which can't discuss itself. You know,
and when you happen to be the victim of that, did you feel bitter?
Yeah, but see, I wasn't the only victim. I think everybody is the victim of censorship. You know, readers are the victim just as much as writers. That's to say, you get told by somebody else what you can read, as well as me being told what I can write. So the censorship is as much a pressure on the reader as on the writer. And in my view, you know, what should happen is, I do agree that we live in a time, not just in India, but everywhere, where people are very easily offended, where taking offense seems to be a kind of national pastime, you know, and and I say not just in India.
And does that impose a special duty on a writer, and particularly a famous and popular one like yourself?
No, I think there's a need to argue about about this problem of offense, that people need to start being a little less thin-skinned. You know, that's to say, a free society, a confident, free, democratic society, is one in which every kind of voice is heard. You know, every kind of voice, including reprehensible voices, including voices to which other people.
So you're saying don't fight scared of it, but continually push out the boat and educate.
Yes, and you know, the only answer to an idea is a better idea, as somebody once said. You know, that if you don't like somebody's ideas, you argue against them, you don't suppress them. You know, I mean, an example of this happened not long after the trouble began for me, when there was a Pakistani film made which portrayed me in absolutely defamatory manner. You know, it portrayed me as a murderer and torturer and sadist and drunkard and, you know, person wearing very unpleasant safari suits. And there was initially in England, because the film was so obviously defamatory, an attempt to ban it. And in the end, it was I who had to go to the Board of Censors and say, please do not protect me by an act of censorship. I'm fighting an anti-censorship battle. The film was then licensed and immediately died because the film was a terrible film and nobody wants to go see a bad movie. People can make up their own minds.
And the opposite would have also been true, that if the film had been censored, it would have somehow been considered a brilliant film.
Exactly. It would have become a kind of hot
So exposure to daylight actually reveals things in their right perspective.
Yes. And one of my problems is that because you know, some of my work was banned, that people now say all sorts of things about what's inside my book.
Without knowing it.
Without knowing it, and without my being able to say, look, if you just look at page so-and-so, you can see that that's not true.
But in fact, the great tragedy is that, in fact, the book never got to be read, and yet, in a very real sense, you suffered for it. You spent a whole decade in hiding, frequently trying to escape from possible assassins. What sort of life was that?
Well, it was very difficult at the beginning, you know, because at the beginning, I didn't know what was coming in my direction from the Iranian threat, you know, and we therefore had to take very extreme measures to defend against it. I mean, I think had it remained like that, unchangingly, for 11 years, it would have been completely
But was it in the
intolerable.
beginning, as we've been told, a different bed every night?
No, that was much exaggerated in the press, but I mean, I was moving every couple of weeks or so, you know, and that's or sometimes, you know, after 3 or 4 weeks. But
so you were a man of no permanent address?
Exactly, exactly. And
Did you feel rootless? Did you suddenly feel as if you've been shaken around?
Well, it's a very, I mean, it was a very, very disturbing thing. I mean, just simply because if you're a writer, you're familiar with being in a certain room with your books and things around you, you know, and suddenly for a writer to be deprived of his library, you know, is like cutting off an arm.
What was the most painful thing for you? Because people can't really understand this extreme denial of liberty that you've been through. But when it happened, what does a human being miss most?
Well, I mean, I then at that time had, you know, my son Zafar who was with me, you know, here in India. But he's now almost 21. At the time that this happened, he was not even 10.
So a whole period of his growing up, you simply lost touch with him?
Yeah, it was very difficult, let's say, to stay in touch. And there were simple things that fathers do with their sons, you know, take them out into the park to kick a ball around, that I was not able to do with him for a long time. And when he asked me why I couldn't do that, it was very hard to know how to answer him.
And what about personal friendships and meaningful relationships? How easy was it to just let them happen? And
well, actually, the truth is that my friends were an incredible resource to me, you know, and many people said to me, were people kind of alarmed to be around you and so on? And actually, the opposite was true. I think what happened is that I actually have more close friends now than I had 11 years ago, because people were so, in the most, you know, the most rather marvelous way, determined to ally themselves with me and to help me.
And in a strange way, does this process make you aware of the real meaning of friendship, of fellow human beings?
Yes, it did. I mean, I think one of the things I've often felt is that I was able to see human nature, you know, both at its worst and at its best. I mean, the kind of most extreme forms, you know, the people at their most intolerant and if you like, even menacing, violent on the one hand. On the other hand, people incredibly loving and full of the highest virtues, you know, friendship, solidarity, honesty, principle, etc. And so I was given a real education, actually, in the best of human nature. And that's, I think, helped me a lot.
And yet the paradox is, at the same time as you were learning to love and value human beings and the warmth of human contact, 2 of your marriages during this process ended. Was that difficult to handle?
Yeah, I mean, it's well, I mean, only one. Well, one ended right at the beginning, and that, frankly, was on the verge of ending anyway. I mean, it wasn't related. And I mean, you know, it's very painful in personal relationships when things don't work out. But I don't think, frankly, the causes for that are to be found in this political event that happened to my life. They're more private things, and well, I mean, it's always bewildering to be put in a situation where your normal picture of the world is broken. You know, I mean, all of us walk around inside a kind of picture of the world that we have, and that's what we call reality, and it's the thing through which we understand what happens to us. And what happened to me when this began was that somebody smashed that picture, you know, and I had to, in a way, reimagine the world, you know, for myself, and that's a very radical process. But I mean, actually, to be straightforward, I think for a writer, it's not an unhelpful process to go through.
But for an individual, when you have to recreate your world and everything's been shattered and you're picking the pieces and making it fresh again, did you find that you were actually recreating yourself as well? And did you learn things about yourself?
Well, yes, I did learn things about myself. I mean, I learned, I suppose, well, put it like this, if you had asked me 11 years ago whether I would have been able to survive an experience such as this and come out, you know, reasonably not crazy, reasonably not smashed up by it, I would probably have doubted my ability to come through.
So you've discovered an inner resilience.
Well, I discover I'm tougher than I thought, perhaps, you know, and I think this is, you know, many times when people are put, for whatever reason, you know, into a position where much is asked of them, you know, in whatever way, I'm thinking of the Lebanon hostages or whatever it might be, people discover themselves to be capable of what they thought they were not capable of.
For 12 long years, you lived with fear as a constant companion. What does fear mean to you?
No, I think fear, you know, the odd thing about fear is that I'm not very conscious of it. And I think in my novel, The Moor's Last Sigh, the narrator there, for other reasons, is talking about the workings of fear, and he says something which I'll paraphrase, but it's very much what I also think, which is that fear is a kind of tyrant. You know, fear is an absolutist, and with fear it's all or nothing. He says, you know, that's to say, either you surrender to it,
or you conquer it,
or you give it up, you set it aside. You know,
was that setting aside conscious and deliberate on your part? Did you decide I have to do it, otherwise I can't survive?
Well, it's that you can't function. You know, I mean, if fear is there in the middle of your life, then all you can do is sit in the corner and shake. You know, there's nothing else that can happen. You can't make phone calls, let alone write books. And so in order to be able to lead a livable life, in order to lead the kind of life that I wanted to lead, you know, with my work, with my friends, with my family, and so on, you just have to say, okay, that's there, but I'll put it over there, and I don't have time for that.
And when you put fear aside, did you also put aside the normal human scare of death? Does that worry you?
No, I mean, what happens is that I think most of us, and I think that's not just because somebody's been trying to kill me, but after all, I'm about to be 53 years old. You do find yourself thinking more about death at the age of almost 53 than you do at the age of, you know, 20. And
so you internalize it because you're living with it, and then it's not such a fear any longer.
It's just no, I'm not afraid of it. I mean, I think, you know, in this period of time, for reasons which have nothing to do with death threats, several of my close friends and family you know, have died. My first wife died, my son's mother, just a few months ago, and it happens, you know. I mean, it's a terrible thing when you arrive in middle life.
Except that it's a different thing when you have to live with the prospect of your own death happening any moment.
No, but I don't. You see, I don't. I mean, I think this kind of drama.
Again, you cast it aside.
No, I think this is a drama which is more in other people's minds than mine. You know, I really, literally, I don't have time for this. I've got a lot to do. I have a very rich life in many ways.
So your attitude is to get up and get on with your life, regardless of the circumstances that subscribe it.
That's right. I mean, there's a great sentence in Joseph Conrad's story, The Nigger of the Narcissus, in which the title character, who is a sick sailor, you know, more or less dying in the front of the boat, his fellow sailors say to him, well, you know, why did you sign on? Why did you come on the boat if you knew you were so ill? And he said, I must live until I die.
Tell me something, live until you die is absolutely correct. In the 1980s, when you were once asked, do you believe in God, you came up with an evocative phrase, I have a God-shaped hole in my heart.
Yeah.
What did you mean?
Well, what it means is that I think if you grow up in a country like this, where religion is everywhere, where it permeates the whole of life, it inevitably shapes some of the way in which you look at the world and some of the way in which your thought processes work. You know, if then at a later point in your life you find that you're not yourself religious, that you don't have any kind of formal religious belief, then there's a kind of absence which would, for other people, be filled by whatever they would call God. You know? And yet, much of your cast of mind is still shaped by that context in which you grew up.
It's a sort of paradox you have to live with.
Yes. So,
but has God today filled that void for you? Today, are you a believer?
No, I don't feel. I've just never felt the need. You know, I mean, it doesn't, for me, answer the great questions that I like to try and answer. That's to say.
But in 1990, when you wrote your essay,
yes,
did you not at that point in time suggest to the audience that you were once again
Well,
embracing
I mean,
Islam?
I did, and I've 1,000 times said that I think it was a political mistake to have done that. I mean, I was more or less.
Was it weakness rather than a
Yeah.
mistake?
Well, weakness or mistake or despair. I mean, it was all sorts of things. It was a thing I shouldn't have done because it wasn't true.
Do you regret it?
I regret doing it because I regret saying things that aren't so, and I did very rapidly. I mean, within a couple of months.
What motivated you to do it? Because you're a man of principle and toughness, and as you say, incarceration made you tough.
Yeah.
And yet there was this one moment when you sort of
Yeah.
put your principles aside and you did something you regret. Why?
Well, partly desperation, just trying to get rid of the problem. Partly because everybody was telling me I should make some conciliatory gesture. I mean, I can't tell you the amount of pressures there were on me to do something
You
of
were
that
desperate
sort.
to end the
And
problem.
I just wanted to say to people, I'm not any kind of enemy, and it was a wrong way to do it, but it was because not accurate, not truthful. But I still want to say that. I still feel that I was very wrongly cast as some kind of demon figure, and I've never felt like that.
But right through this painful 12-year process, God is not something that you've come to embrace. What do you believe in today? What does Salman Rushdie hold dear? What's
I
important?
think there are great. I mean, I believe in the great human values, of love and friendship and truth and plain dealing and
There's
openness.
something very cold and academic about that.
No, there isn't. I mean, I think these are the warmest things in life. What's cold and academic about love? What's cold and academic about friendship and telling the truth? I mean, these are passionate things.
Do you think this is one reason why when you ended up writing about religion and people took offense, that you didn't mean to give offense, but there was something cold and analytical about the manner in which you did it,
I don't
which
think
lacked that passion and warmth of faith?
I don't think that faith is the only thing which has passion and warmth. And I think anybody who reads my work can see that it is warm and funny and human and so on. I think, look, it's perfectly possible to write seriously about religion from a dissenting point of view. It's a completely honorable procedure. I think what happened is that, first of all, the work was seriously misrepresented and sloganized. It turned into kind of caricatures of itself. And then that was backed up by an extremely powerful and well-orchestrated political campaign. I mean, very efficient one, very effective one. And it became almost impossible for me to argue seriously about what I was writing, because, what I was asked was, didn't you say such and such, or haven't you done so and so? Everything was done in terms of slogans. And a novel is not a slogan.
So what you're saying is when people turned around, as they have also been saying in Delhi when you came this time around, that he's given terrible offense to people, you're actually saying, no, I didn't give offense. You didn't understand. And worse still, what you've understood has been misrepresented to you.
Well, I doubt whether one of the people who protested about my work in Delhi yesterday have ever opened and looked at a page of it. I would very much doubt it. It's very difficult to understand how you can offend people when they've never looked at what you've done.
So when they turn around and say Salman Rushdie hasn't really understood the enormity of the offense he's caused us, what do you say to them?
Well, I say that offense has never been a limiting point in thought. That's what I would say. And I would say that the great battles for freedom of the imagination, for freedom of thought, for philosophical and intellectual freedom that have been fought in many cultures, not just this one, were precisely fought against the idea that the church should have the final say about what may be said and what may not be said. I mean, this was the battle of the Enlightenment in Europe. The enemy of the Enlightenment was not politicians, it was the Pope. It was the
And you're also suggesting that that still
Inquisition.
has to happen in the subcontinent.
I'm just saying, for a culture to be open-minded, confident, and fearless about itself, it has to allow every sort of voice to speak. Now, the Satanic Verses, like all my work, and I rather regret having my work reduced to one book, because I've written 12, of which that was the 5th. I've written 7 books since the Satanic Verses. I think if you look at that book in the context of all my work, you will see that all my work is questioning, and all of it is born of a deep love for the country I come from and for the people I came from. And I try and write about their lives in this country and outside this country, how they have been challenged by changes in their circumstances, where they live. And
Would you like today the ban lifted so that the book can be understood, so that you can be judged in terms of more than just one
Well,
product?
yes, of course I would. I mean, as I say, the point about...
Do you make that as an appeal?
I've made it as an appeal a dozen times. I mean, the appeal's there on the record.
Except that it's different when you're sitting in
Yeah, no,
Delhi.
of course, naturally. I do. But the point of it is very simple. It's that people, in my mind, really can make up their own minds. And I don't necessarily think that they would make up their minds in my favor, But at least
give them the chance
at
to
least
do so.
Let the debate be an informed debate. What happens with a ban is you have an uninformed debate. And And it is surely better that people should know what they're arguing about. You know, even if at the end of it, they still say what they now say. Let them at least say it on the basis of knowledge rather than, you know, a lack of knowledge.
Let's go back to the very beginning. June 1947, you were born in Bombay. What sort of family were you born in?
Well, my father's family actually is a Delhi family. It was a Delhi Muslim family from the Ballimara Mohalla of Chandni Chowk. And my mother's family is a Kashmiri family, although they had settled in Aligarh, where my mother's father, was working as a doctor affiliated to the Aligarh Muslim University. When my parents married, they first lived in Old Delhi. And then in 1946, I think, when they had decided they did not wish to go to Pakistan, they also were worried about, you know, the trouble that might be ahead, and they moved to Bombay, really, I don't know, 8 or 9 months before I was born, because they felt things would be quieter there, and in fact, things were quieter there.
How do you remember those years? Because the 50s were new periods for India.
Yes.
Excitement. Was it exciting?
It's a wonderful city to be a child in. You know, it really, in my memory, to growing up in Bombay in the 50s was a very happy time and very exciting time, and I have very, very vivid memories of it. Of course, one of the strange things is that when you grow up in a city, you believe it to be eternal. You know, you believe that the neighborhood you grow up in has always been there, and that you're simply arriving in a place which is of the ages, you know. And as I grew up and read more about Bombay, I discovered that actually these neighborhoods were very new. You know, I mean, they were more or less 20 or 30 years old at the most. And
you assumed they'd always been there, they were part of your childhood.
Exactly. But I mean, but even 25 years ago, you know, I lived on Warden Road. You know, it was quite new. I mean, a lot of these buildings had been built really quite soon before people like my parents moved in.
You said somewhere that you always carry India in your heart. Is it Bombay that you carry with you? And
Bombay,
everything that Bombay stands for?
Well, I think more that. It's more... yes, I still carry with me a lot of the streets. I mean, the street map of Bombay is still in my head quite straightforwardly. I mean, you could put me down in Bombay.
But more than that, it's the values that you associate. What are those values?
Well, I think the kind of life that I had in Bombay, the kind of family I was from, which although it was an Indian Muslim family, it was a very cosmopolitan and kind of secularized family. So we had friends of every conceivable religion, and you know, I played with you know, in my own neighborhood, kids of all sorts of backgrounds, including, you know, Western kids, but also of every possible religious background. And you know, we observed everybody else's festivals. You know, so Navjot one day, Ganpati the next day, Eid the next day. You know, and the effect of that kind of multiplicity of religion was to create a kind of equalizing effect, you know, and a very free and tolerant effect. And my memory of Bombay and of the kind of values that my parents instilled in me was that kind of, if you like, cosmopolitan tolerance.
And when you come back to India today, do you think it's changed? And if it's changed, has it changed for the better or the worse?
Well, it's changed in both directions simultaneously, which is what happens to all places.
But when you look at things like the Hindu narrow-mindedness that one sees,
Yeah.
or the saffronization of politics that people talk about,
Well,
or sometimes the narrowing of just horizons.
Well, I mean, I've written about this over these years, you know, and when I wrote in the Moors Last Side, one of the things I wrote about there was the way in which that Bombay that we've been discussing has been replaced by, you know, what one should call Mumbai, I suppose. You know, that Mumbai is not quite the same city as Bombay, although it occupies the same space, and is...
The change of name is telling.
And yes, and is a harsher city, you know. I mean, the idea that Muslim families, you know, feel too alarmed to have their nameplates up, you know, they have to unscrew their name from the halls of their buildings because they're afraid of what might happen if people know that Muslims live in a certain place. Well, that's unthinkable in the Bombay that I'm talking about.
And yet this is the India you've returned to. Will you come back again?
Well, no, look, that's just one example. You know, I mean, India is just simply, it's in my blood, you know, and this is where I'm from. You know, I don't have the option to reject it. It's just me. And as a result, yes, I'll come back as often as I can, and no doubt I'll go on speaking my mind about it, and sometimes people will like what I have to say, and sometimes they won't. But that's the duty of the writer, as I've always seen it.
That's also the right of an Indian, as you are?
Well, yes, but I mean, I think it's the right of anybody in living in a free society. But, you know, one of the first, probably the first serious literary influence on me was the great Urdu poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz, who was a close friend of our family. And what I saw in Faiz was somebody who was, on the one hand, a great lyric poet, a wonderful poet of love, on the other hand, a great public poet, you know, a poet who responded to the events of his time. And I thought, that's the job. You know, that you should be able to with equal passion, with equal clarity, and with equal individuality of vision, be able to write about the most profound things in private life and the most important things in public life.
So this visit is in fact the beginning of what one hopes will be many more to come.
I hope so.
Salman Rushdie, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.
Welcome home as well.
Thank you.